Welcome to the Decentralized Mind podcast. And I'm your host, Emanuela Arbani. Today I have with me Dr. Leland Stillman. Thank you for being here, Dr.
Thank you
Stillman.
for having me.
No problem. So, the reason why I call the podcast the Decentralized Mind is because I want to address a little bit about how we think and how the way that we think is affecting our ability to get results. I was scrolling through your feed some time ago, and one of your reels, you were talking about how people would rather pay, X amount of money for surgery than say, change their lifestyle.
Yes.
And I even think this applies to let's call it alternative world, or the world in which we use nature or herbs or whatever it is, because people would rather take a pill, even if it's a natural supplement, than say mitigate EMFs in their home.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a fundamental problem with how we think.
Yes.
What have you seen certain things that help people change the way they think? Or do you think that's really their life that ends up forcing them to do that?
So this reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. Albert Szent-Györgyi, the researcher who discovered vitamin C, he also did some very pioneering work on water and hydrogen. Anyway, he said, let me pull this up. Here we stand in this new world with our primitive brain attuned to the simple cave life with terrific forces at our disposal, which we are clever enough to release, but whose consequences we cannot comprehend. He said this as a Hungarian immigrant to the United States in the wake of World War II and the invention of atomic weaponry. And the world has changed so much since then. It's almost been 100 years since we invented atomic weapons. And I think people probably are less afraid of, say, things like AI than they are of nuclear weapons. But I don't think that these things are any less dangerous. Let's just put it that way. And I think Szent-Györgyi really seizes on this very powerful observation about human biology, which is that we are wired for this world that's very simple, right? You look at the news, what does the news cover? They're more likely to cover shark attacks than something like, oh, we've just linked this chemical to this terrible disease. Now, as these diseases like Parkinson's and, the paper on Parkinson's and golf courses is making the rounds now,
Yep.
as these diseases become more well known and understood, people become more aware of them because the horror of these illnesses becomes real to them. And so change and behavior does change, but it's decades behind the reality that we see in clinical practice when we really see patients and we take care of them and we act on best evidence, often in an empiric way. And so this understanding of the human mind is something that I became fascinated with early in my career because I perceived that it wasn't a lack of therapeutics. It wasn't necessarily a lack of knowledge. It was people just had these terrible ideas about how to get healthy and be well that were rooted in their ability and their how their brain is wired, how it's set up. So I started reading extensively in the world of behavioral economics. Thomas Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Dan Ariely, very fascinating insights on how economics drive human behavior. Things people don't think about. Like, did you know something called the penny gap exists? 9 times as many people will accept a Hershey's Kiss as a gift if it's free than if you charge them 1 penny for it.
Right.
Interesting, right? Just 1 penny, 9 times as many takers. So these little things are very powerful. And I think the first step to making better decisions is understanding the flaws in your decision making framework. Because if you don't start there, you're just playing from a position where other people who understand how your human nature is are going to exploit that. And so I see it all the time. I see people making these offers to patients that are just terrible deals. I mean, terrible opportunities. Like, no one should do that surgery. No one should take that supplement. Like, no, stop. Put that in a dumpster somewhere, sideline, sunset this therapy. No one should do this. But people are like, sign me up. Let's go. Sounds great. And yeah, very powerful, very important. I love that you are focused on that.
Like a lack of critical thinking skills.
Well,
Actually,
we think about it as a lack of critical thinking. I actually
but it's
think so that
not.
this came out of my study in ecology. I became a biology major at my college, Connecticut College, over 10 years ago by accident. I was intending to become, I meant to major in cellular and molecular, no, it was biochemistry and cellular and molecular biology. And I didn't need to take the course ecology to major in that, but I did by accident because I thought I had to. And I ended up not having enough time to actually complete the first major I had proposed. And I ended up having to do the biology major, which was one of the best things I ever did because in ecology 207, biology 207 with Robert Askins, we covered something called the ecological niche hypothesis. And I sat next to a good friend of mine, Charles Van Rees, who's now an ornithologist. And Charles introduced me later to this concept of ecological traps. This was during residency when I was training at Maine at Maine Medical Center. Ecological traps are really interesting. So this concept came out of the observation that these ephemeral insects, these springtime insects, would lay their eggs on tombstones and driveways. And biologists were like, this is terrible. They're laying their eggs on tombstones and driveways because they reflect polarized light the way that water does. And so the insect is making a mistake because it doesn't have the wiring in its brain to distinguish between tombstones
Mm.
and asphalt and water. And our brains are the same way. Like we see light from an LED that's a broad spectrum, but it's totally imbalanced. It's nothing like sunlight, and we can't tell the difference. And we're surrounded. These are called ecological traps because it's a trap in the environment into which a species or an individual can pour resources and energy. And in the case of those insects, their most important thing, their children, their offspring, they can pour all that energy into this thing, and it can be a complete dead end. Very dark when we look at this in human nature.
How
Uh,
much of that, like, in humans, how much
mm,
of that do you think is the slow conditioning or even, the potential that our environment, artificial light, all of these things has slowly trained us to be more susceptible?
very hard to say. I don't know the answer to that. I think we're very much in an arms race against ourselves because if we don't recognize our mistakes fast enough, the same kind of thinking that leads us into ecological traps persists. And so if people don't start to think about these bigger picture problems, humanity just remains mired in the same paradigms. And I do see this as I do see divergence happening in society where there are people who are, and I don't know how this is all going to play out, but there are people who are realizing how dangerous artificial light and EMFs are, for example, not to mention processed food, heavy metals, weather modification, all of these things. They're recognizing that, and many of them want a radical return to a natural environment. And they're willing to divorce themselves from mainstream society in order to do that or have that. And then there's other people who just don't seem to care less. And some of them wake up and choose differently later. But there's a remarkable resistance to that, right? Which is also human nature. So I don't know what's going to happen. I think it's a fascinating time to be alive. I think you're going to see, people, if I 20, 30 years ago, it was sort of like they're the Amish and then there's everybody else. I think 10, 20, 30 years from now, there could be the Amish and then all these people who are living somewhere between 18 whatever and now the present. And then there's people who are going to be really on the cutting, bleeding edge, and Lord only knows what they'll be doing because it's already pretty weird what's going on out there. And the pace of change is only accelerating.
Yes, for sure. And I do think, like, I have little kids, and I was in a unique situation growing up because I was homeschooled from grade three to the end of grade eight.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't allowed to TV or really computers much. So I spent my whole life reading and outside. And my mom was really hands off with education too. So she was like, here's the pages for you to do on your own. And then I just followed my own mind tumbling across, life or the world. And I think that, you know, the way our kids are being raised, and not just whether you are in regular school or, homeschooled or whatever it is, but also how close are you in telling your kids what they should think, and how much are you allowing them to explore different options affects how fast you can jump from, well, they told me this, so how can this be true? To, well, maybe that sounds more intuitive than that, or maybe that sounds more in line with what we would have done as humans than the other thing. And I found it interesting about your background that your mom ended up exploring, the alternative world, or like outside of conventional medicine when you were a kid. Do you think that that kind of thing, whatever it may manifest in different people, helps them make the leap when different information is presented to them?
Yes. And that has to do with what I would call the biology of behavior change and learning. And I think this is a very fascinating area. When you really look at how people learn, it's actually somewhat discouraging that they're so difficult to teach, particularly as they get older, right? Now, part of that is by design. If we just came up with new ideas faster than we already do and everyone adopted them, the rate of change would be insane. Plus, a lot of the time, you don't realize that there's a good reason for you to do what you'd been doing and that you should not try and reinvent the wheel, right? So, like, for example, nature doesn't put a lot of fluoride in the water ever, anywhere, period, full stop, end of story. So you should look and think twice about adding fluoride to the water. And of course, we did that for decades. We've just removed it entirely from the Florida water due to a lot of intense activism. Shout out to all my friends who fought that fight. And we've really well established now that fluoride lowers IQ and contributes to many types of chronic disease. And this, to many of us, this was not a revelation. This could have easily been determined 100 years ago, but somehow it took off. So it's a really interesting balance between change on the one hand and innovation that for the better, right? We use cutting edge technology in my medical practice all the time. A lot of it is, years old, which is nothing in the scope of therapeutics. And we get great results, and we would never go back to not using it. But at the same time, you are going to have things come out that, and I think that with enough study and time, they're pretty easy to spot. I haven't had a therapeutic, and I'm pretty conservative with therapeutics in the sense, that I won't endorse it until I've really seen it work and I can justify it from what are essentially first principles. I don't see any reason why, based on an understanding of just fundamental laws and rules of biology, this would be bad for my patient, right? But on top of that, moreover, you have to look at the way things are done in nature. And if you're going to deviate from that, you have to have a really, really good reason. And you need to be very careful because small mistakes can have a huge impact.
And I think for, some modalities that, or even let's say minerals, right? For example, because I know you talk a lot about minerals.
Mm-hmm.
I take, magnesium in relatively high doses because I was
Mm-hmm.
raised a strict vegetarian. So my magnesium levels were shot for, a long time. And I
Really?
found that doing this enabled me to be extremely well adapted to the cold. I live in Canada, in Ontario, where it's cold for a lot of the year. And it totally changed a lot of things for me. My ability to tolerate caffeine or sleep better, progesterone levels, all these things. But also, my need for it reduced when I fully mitigated my house. And my need for it is eliminated when I go on vacation.
Mitigated from EMF. Yes?
Yes. Well, not just EMF, but light, right? My whole house is
Yes.
incandescents for daytime, always a window open, even in the winter. Black light is more common in Canada than red light. So I have black lights for nighttime.
Huh.
I know, I don't know why. And, my TV's tinted a deep shade of red. All of my computers, phones, everything. So if
Mm-hmm.
we're on the TV, it's hardwired and it's red, basically.
I know what you mean. I'm not surprised by that. I had a patient recently. He tried thyroid hormone at my recommendation a year ago, was sort of unimpressed. I didn't give him a very aggressive dose, though. I just wanted to sort of, try it out because he was complaining of afternoon fatigue and declines in his metabolism, weight gain, things like that. And his labs fit the picture of hypothyroidism. And he bailed on it because he just didn't see enough value. And then I don't know if it was 6 months later, something like that, he comes back to me and he said, "Hey, I really mitigated his apartment step by step. First, he started to unplug the Wi-Fi router. Then he hardwired the router and eliminated the Wi-Fi signal completely. Then he started to wear this protective gear, which I'd been skeptical of because if you put anything that conducts electricity on your body, it technically becomes an antenna. So I'm not a big fan of this, but he started to wear it and he was blown away by the results. He said, Leland, Dr. Stillman, whatever, this was more effective than Armor Thyroid for me. And I thought, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Thyroid is a really powerful tool. I mean, a really powerful tool. We dosed it in micrograms. Micrograms. You would struggle to see a milligram on your kitchen countertop. And I dosed this in micrograms. Wow, 1/1000th of what you can barely see. And I was blown away by his testimonial, but it's not the only one I've had. My father, who wouldn't listen to me for years about this, finally got rid of his Wi-Fi router underneath his desk. The lower extremity edema, swelling in one leg that he had on the side of his body next to the router, disappeared the next week. Wow. So it's but this goes back to what you opened with, which is basically people view this as hard, and so they kick it down the road. But at the end of the day, there's no debate. I mean, where there is debate, it's from people who just they don't they don't actually wrestle with these things in clinical practice. They don't see patients. They're just closed-minded. They're just stuck in their dogma, and they refuse to really read the literature. There's no debate that microwave and radio wave radiation, not to mention all kinds of other EMF that are non-native to our biosphere, there is a reason life doesn't use these frequencies of light. And life can create all varieties of light from infrared to ultraviolet. Why wouldn't it touch everything south or below infrared light? A big clue, big, obvious, how do you miss this one clue? But that is just human nature. I really wonder what's going to happen. I mean, the population implosion is basically starting because modern lifestyles, diets, environments are so toxic and unsustainable. Not to mention the thinking and philosophies and ideals or ideologies that have arisen from them.
Yes.
Anyway.
And I do think addressing your external environment changes how you think too. Like personal experience for me is my mom. She used to be a certain way. She used to be very closed-minded. She used to be very set in her ways. She used to
Mm-hmm.
struggle with articulation of speaking. It used to be difficult to explain things to her. I would have to repeat things 5, 10 times at a time. And when she started learning, I started sending her information about all of this. She mitigated her whole house, ate because she came from vegetarian. So she switched out of that, started eating lots of seafood, some meat, seasonal only kind of thing. And it's like her brain changed, her personality changed almost. All of a sudden I can tell her something once instead of 3 times, or 5 times. And it's easier for her to grasp things. It's easier for her to think outside the box. And she almost feels less limited. And it's not like I tried to do anything. I pretty much didn't bother. I was like, it's a lost cause. But then, she starts implementing all these lifestyle changes like, sunrise, cold, getting tons of sunlight, all of these things, and changes her house. And it's almost like she's got a personality shift. She's still the same person, but she's just easier to deal with.
Have you told her this, or is she going to be hearing it from the first time here?
No, I know she'll be fine.
Yeah. No, I completely understand. It is very, when you actually realize how much light shapes life, and from the extreme low frequency spectrum, electromagnetic fields like magnetic fields and microwaves and radio waves, etc., all the way up to the UV spectrum, let alone above that, X-rays and high intensity or high energy radiation. It is just you begin to really, for me, it actually began a 2 or 3 year period of just, oh my gosh, it's so much worse than I thought it was when all I knew was food and toxins and biochemistry. Like I thought we had a big project on our hands to right the ship of, modern day society. If we were just going to get everyone to stop eating toxic waste disguised as food, otherwise known as processed food, I thought that was enough work for all of us together, working very hard and getting everything right. And then when I thought, oh my gosh, I have to get everybody to change their light bulbs and they have to stop using their tech devices to which they're addicted. And I'm going to tell them they have to stop being connected to the world 24/7. Well, this is a much bigger hill to climb. But
Yeah.
it's, the crazy thing is like part of how we built the practice is that when you get people healthy because they're willing to put in the time and effort, then they need less medical care. And then you can take care of more people and you can keep them healthy rather than being on the constant treadmill of I need another consult, another supplement, another protocol, another this, another that. And there's a night and day difference between the people who put in the work to mitigate their homes, their environments. And I do my best to reiterate to them, you've got to do this. It's really important. I know it's hard. It's going to take a weekend. You just got to sit down and do it.
It's a one and done though, like it's
I know, and that's why it's so painful when I come back and I'm like, "Did you do that thing I recommend?" No, I didn't do that. I bought all that stuff that some of which you told me to buy. Some of this other stuff I bought because somebody else told me to buy it, and it still's not working. I'm like, well, you know, maybe it's time to do that thing I told you to do that you said just didn't feel like doing. Just throwing it out there. But I just, I get it because I was there too once, and it's hard. It's really hard, and it also becomes a matter of I had a patient recently ask me, should I go see my daughter or son and play with my grandkids? And removing yourself from unhealthy environments where your loved ones are is a, is that a good trade off? Because that love has its own healing power. It gets messy, very
I
messy.
mean, and also like I think the chasing of perfection is another thing all in its own, right? Like once your
Oh, totally.
home is, if
Yes.
you mitigate your home, your whole living environment as best as you can,
Mm-hmm.
given things you cannot control, like hey, addition of a tower or whatever,
Yeah,
when you go into your family's environment, you're going to be stronger to deal with it. So you can just set that aside and engage in that emotional relationship at a higher depth because you're going to be suffering less.
absolutely.
So it doesn't have to be eh, all or nothing, really.
And it also can't turn into this doom spiral of, well, nothing is perfect and therefore I will never get healthy. That's just not true. Seen so many patients. I mean, I'm blown away by some of the cases I take on, and I'm like, I think this person is going to need to radically change their diet and lifestyle to get any kind of results. And then I just give them some supplements and some simple things to do, and they're like, I'm all better now. Thank you. I can never predict that.
Yeah.
And so I certainly don't want to set that up as an expectation because I have other people who they do everything right and they still don't get well, at least in the time scale that they want, right? But that is, part of the challenge is what's the time frame, what's an appropriate time frame for healing. It's different for everyone, and sometimes you just can't. I mean, you can't ever predict it. It's never predictable.
And, as a medical doctor, what is your viewpoint on just bringing the topics back to minerals and tying it to
Mm-hmm.
environment and EMFs,
Mm-hmm.
iron supplementation, right? Like I used to
Yeah.
have endometriosis, heavy
Yes.
bleeding. I coach clients
Yes.
to make lifestyle
Yes.
changes for that. And I'm always like, I don't like the iron supplements. One, because if you're bleeding too much and you don't address the blood loss, like I like to use herbs and phototherapy because I find that's usually very effective in the short
Great.
term, right? Then it's kind of like donating blood on one arm and getting an infusion of blood on the other. And the pill doesn't account for when you think of a woman hemorrhaging, like it just the math doesn't add up. But
I
how
agree.
would you explain it from an environmental standpoint when someone's taking an iron supplement and isn't mitigating EMFs or blue light? how does that ROS, that, let's call it free radical things, get worse?
Yeah, great question. Huge topic. Let's Here's where what I would start with. We tend to see the worst problems with iron handling in the people who have the most deranged physiology underneath the iron metabolism. This is very difficult to quantify and very difficult to sort of get to the root of. But, I'll give you an example. I have a gentleman in the practice who came to me with a hemoglobin of 9.4, which is quite anemic, especially for a man men tend to have higher hematocrit and hemoglobin levels than women because we historically are wired to go out and kill each other through blood loss, right? So we have more of it. Anyway, he came in with a 9.4. I looked at his nutritional panel, gave him a bunch of different things that are known to be necessary for hemoglobin production. He bounced up to something like 12.6, which is in the normal range for men. And that anemia he had had for 35 years. He'd seen tons of doctors for it. That proved to me that people are not looking at micronutrients the way that they need to look at them. Micronutrients like B6, copper, vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin C, B9, folate, B12, all these things people don't understand. And I don't say that in the sense that, I have some kind of special, unique knowledge. I think I do, but I still have more questions than answers. And I still look at blood panels and I think, I don't know why this red cell mean corpuscular hemoglobin level is high. This person has no signs of the micronutrient deficiencies on any testing I can find. Anyway, what we see in general, though, is that as we fix the environment, the diet, the lifestyle, we mitigate everything, really profound changes can happen in that blood panel. And we cannot link any one thing to the change. Sometimes it's more profound than others. His case, he had a very clear deficit of some micronutrients. But I'll have people who, they've got an anemia, they've got altered red cell size. They don't have any abnormalities on their blood counts. And their blood counts may not actually improve. They may look very much the same, but they feel so much better depending upon what we do along all these lines, right? So when I look at iron supplementation, it will give people more iron in the immediate term that they can then use to create energy, because you need iron for, in my view, two big things. And it's really three, but there's two really, really big ones. One is you have iron sulfur clusters in your mitochondria that are necessary for electrons to pass through the membrane for energy to be generated. So you need iron for energy generation, which is why the number one complaint of people with a low ferritin or low blood level of iron is fatigue. You also need them to carry oxygen around the body on hemoglobin, right? I will also mention there's tons of other iron dependent enzymes in the human body, but those two big categories explain why fatigue is the number one complaint of people with low iron. When you just dump more iron into the system, you will fix the fatigue and you may fix the red blood cell deficit. However, the iron is potentially accumulating in the cells, creating more reactive oxygen species, creating more oxidative stress, creating more wear and tear on the body. This then can ultimately then erupt into more inflammatory diseases. So what do? We have to fix iron handling at the cellular level. And that doesn't come just down to fixing levels of nutrients. It also comes down to getting rid of heavy metals that interfere with iron handling and that also interfere with micronutrients that then are used by the body to handle and traffic iron. And so that's why detoxification is such a critical step in this process. But none of that works if you're in a very dysfunctional lighting environment where your body is not getting the right signals to heal, rest, rejuvenate, et cetera, or your cellular water can't be structured by your mitochondria by light in such a way that they will be able to generate the energy necessary to repair the body from the damage it's sustained. So they're a sort of a devil's bargain. You'll get your energy back short term. Long term, you're just accumulating a debt or a repair deficit that is going to come back to haunt you. That doesn't necessarily mean we won't use them, but I use them. I'm very, very, very cagey about it because it's, and I've got a patient right now who just went on back on iron supplements because another doctor told them to. And, they have an altered surgical GI anatomy. They can't eat normal quantities of food. I try to give them more. They tell me they're overwhelmed. What more can I do? Right. So that's sometimes the trouble we find ourselves in.
And there's two things that fascinate me the most, two very different topics or things I should say about iron. One is the whole Fe2, Fe3 thing, how most iron supplementation would be like an iron salt versus maybe a hemipeptide, or if you're eating, like I went through a phase where I did experiments and I actually consumed blood. So I had blood and I made blood pancakes, and it made a huge difference. It's great.
No kidding.
Um,
Hmm.
but it was pig's blood actually. Anyways, it actually tasted great, but I'm not gonna get into that. So like even when I was vegetarian for a long time before I knew anything really, and I was working with a ton of naturopaths, I was on iron this, iron that, whatever, and my ferritin was at a 3. This is Canadian values, so I'm not sure how that compares with American values.
It
Um,
sounds terrible.
it's pretty much near zero, right? 3 years it took me to get from a 3 to a 12. I decided when I ditched the vegetarian and I went heavy on the seafood and red meat, because that was the first thing I reintroduced was bivalves, so like oysters, clams, mussels, and
Yeah.
red meat, right? Lamb and beef. And I went from a 12 to a 30 and ditched the iron supplement at the same time in a
How
month.
about that?
Right? So it's like, I don't know. I mean, I get it. People are lazy and they're like, I want a pill. And I'm going to say lazy. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. Um, and the other thing that fascinates me, and then I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is I don't know if you read Holowich's book. The
Yes.
influence, yeah, okay. So one of the
Yeah.
most fascinating experiments in there that I don't think has really
Mm-hmm.
ever been repeated was when he
Mm-hmm.
bled the mice, one in artificial light, one in the sunlight, and the
Yes.
mice in the sunlight also almost all of them survived and they were able
Uh-huh.
to regain their blood volume, whereas
Yes.
ones, in artificial light, most of them
Yep.
died. And I've actually seen this in a client that was having like a chemical miscarriage. And she went from like her blood pressure dropped from 120 over, I think it was 68 to 90 over 48, I think it was. And then the next day went back up to normal by literally lying in the sun, UV index of 7, in a
Mm-hmm.
bikini for the entire
Mm-hmm.
day.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Profound. Very profound. And people are figuring it out because the pain of, and this is where what I think is so interesting about, and where I ended up going with my reading into economics and behavior is that it's really about the stories people tell themselves. I think it was Joan Didion. She said, we are the stories we tell ourselves. And she's just so right about that. And so I had this case recently, a gentleman who came to us, signed up for our biggest program, and he has he is something like 3 months late on lab testing. He is not doing probably 20 or 30% consistently what I would like him to do. And he just told me the other day, he's like, I'm probably 20%, 10% worse. He knows why. And I said, totally get it. Sorry to hear that. And one of the conversations we have been having is, what's the story behind why this isn't important to you? What's the story? So everyone has a story about everything in their life. And the stories are basically maps of how the world works and how we navigate the world to get the results that we want. And so when I hear someone say, well, I can't do that, or I'm not sure about that, or I don't really want to try that, what I'm really hearing is, I don't have belief that that will do for me what I want, and or it doesn't fit into all the other priorities that I have and the things that I'm otherwise invested in doing. And so when people say, I can't get more time outside, I can't change my diet, I can't do this, or I won't do this, they're just saying, I don't believe in the value of that to deliver the outcome. I'm going to put my faith in something else. And that is where it all comes down to, can you change their story? Can you teach them? Do you know how to coach them? And then are they coachable? I mean, there's some people it's like, you just cannot tell them anything. They know everything. I'm like, why do you even pay me? You don't listen. You could, just go buy whatever on the internet. Strangers sell you all kinds of weird stuff. Might work. Hey. Anyway, so that becomes the art of really, and that to me is on a much more powerful level. Then the conversations become about, what is your real goal as a patient? What do you really want? And people often don't know that. And sometimes I think the most important work we do together is to actually clarify that. Do you want to have a family? Do you want to get married? Do you want to be fit? Do you want to be healthy? Do you want to be there for a spouse or a loved one? And usually people are like, of course I want all those things. Most people want the same things as all the other people. It's because we all have essentially the same central nervous system, right? But how we get there, what it looks like, all the little details matter a lot. So it's very common for people to say effectively, well, I want to look as good and feel as good as possible for as long as possible. Well, okay, let's unpack that for a moment. The science of longevity is pretty clear that in order to live as long as possible, you should calorie restrict. You should not have a ton of muscle mass. You should still do weightlifting and that sort of exercise. But their experiments on calorie restriction in, say, primates have been really quite profound. You basically starve them and they live longer. Amazing. But they're not as stress resistant. They're not as strong and they're not as physically impressive. So men will come to me and they'll say, yeah, of course I want to live as long as possible. I'm like, okay, hang on a minute. Let me ask you this. Do you want to be able to carry your wife across the threshold of your bedroom right up until the very end? They're like, well, yeah. I'm like, okay. So that's more important to you than another 5, 10, 15, 20 years of life. And they say, yes, of course. I'm like, so you don't want to live as long as possible. You want to live as long as possible while still being able to do that thing that you care about that makes you a man, right? And that's, to me, for some reason, it's being in relationship with patients and helping them determine what is most important to them. What is the priority? Why are we really here? What animates you? What excites you? What inspires you? What's your purpose? That is something that I'm really connected to in my practice. And it's not like I always have these deeply philosophical conversations with patients, but if you don't go at least some way down this road, I think you often end up wasting time. And patients also don't, I think, really trust you because you're just being superficial with them. You're not really deeply in relationship with them to help them achieve their hopes and dreams, which is arguably the whole point of medical care.
And that comes back to, one of the tenets of, when you think only about what you don't want instead of what you do want, then you can't get what it is that you do want. I think that's very true, especially for people who are struggling with their health. Their physical state causes them to spend so much time thinking about what they don't want, and then they don't have clarity on what they do want, which makes motivation difficult.
And I think that right there is what we call in the practice the difference between focusing on your illness and focusing on your wellness. What does success look like to you? Is a question I will often ask patients. Where would you like to be in 3 to 5 years? If we were going to work together, because we screen everybody who comes into the practice, you don't just click a button and check out. And I'm very intentional about that because I really want to work with people who are A, motivated, B, a good fit for the practice. I want to make sure we can help them. If there's somebody else better to help you, we will send you somewhere else because we think that's appropriate and better for you, better for us. But I want to know for this to be, for us to work with you, where would you need to be in 3 to 5 years for you to say this was a good investment of my time, energy, and obviously money? Because we need to have a conversation about whether or not that's realistic based upon what effort and sacrifice you're willing to put in, which is often ends up being telling people things they don't want to hear. Right. And so very interesting.
Yeah. And I think that overwhelm really plays into how fast you're willing to move. And me, like, I'm a personally, I'm a person who will go whether it's right or wrong, I will
Mm-hmm.
reach the end first because I'll just do everything all at once, all at the
Yes.
same time to
Yes.
the, but then I also get results faster. Like when I implemented all of this thing, I pretty much bulldozed my house, metaphorically speaking, right? I drove absolutely everybody crazy, but I
Mm-hmm.
saw results in a week because I was nuts.
You are going to love my book that's coming out next summer.
Oh, nice.
I have a whole section on this. I'm so excited for it. So stay tuned. I'll let you know
Awesome.
when it's out.
Yes, please do. Please do. And to wrap up, why don't you tell the listeners just like where they can find you, best ways that, the average person can interact with you, stuff like that.
Yes. So I write a newsletter over at Substack, stillmanmd.substack.com. My website is stillmanmd.com. We work with patients in the United States. You have to be able to make it to the United States at least quarterly. So technically, we're not working with people internationally right now, but we have some really funny. Like we have a new patient. She is on a cruise ship half of the year. So it's like, where do you live? I don't know. The sea, but you can make it to Florida quarterly. Great, we'll figure it out. Um, and I say that because it's just been kind of tough with people. Like we have a family in South Africa we take care of, but it's been really tough. The shipping and the lab test. It's just anyway. So we just work generally with people who can make it to the United States at least quarterly for lab testing, supplements, etc. And then everything else, I've got more stuff in the works. I do teach at the Quantum Biology Collective, which is up your alley. Did you take their certification course already?
No, I went through a different certification and I've
Oh,
been a
okay.
backwards member for a long time.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. So I teach there, and those are the opportunities to work with me.
Nice. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time. I hope that this conversation was stimulating to everyone listening. I know it was for me. And that's pretty much it. Thanks so much for
Thank
your
you.
time, and
Yeah, thank
we'll
you for
see you
having
all
me.
next time.
It's been fun. You asked much deeper questions than most podcasters.
Well, thank you. I try
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. Most of
And
the people who get deep into the light rabbit hole are pretty complex thinkers.
yes, maybe more dopamine.
I just think
My excuse.
their curiosity level is a cut above the average bear
Yes.
for
Yes.
sure. So
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening. And we'll see you all in the next one.